the center of the universe, our Mecca. Such is the refrain near universally when rock climbers around the world refer to Yosemite Valley. Climbing in Yosemite has been characterized as pilgrimage from the early accounts of John Muir. As the patron saint of American wilderness, Muir wrote of the Holy Land, stating famously, "No temple made with hands can compare with Yosemite. Every rock in its walls seems to glow with life." Muir's voice is not alone in seeing sacred structures in the stone. Of the major granite domes within the national park boundaries, no less than 7 have the word cathedral in their name. Royal Robbins, the so-called High Lama of rock climbing in Yosemite Valley, famously referred to climbers on the park's highest faces as pilgrims of the vertical. Historian Joseph Taylor elaborates, "Pilgrims of the vertical exhibited a passion that seemingly paralleled other pilgrims. All risked their lives for their spiritual quests, and all romanticized death." The rock at the center of the climbing cosmos, the holiest of holies, the Axis Mundi, is undisputedly El Capitan, the crystal-studded granite monarch of the park, which towers 1,000 meters above the valley floor. Big walls are simply the tallest rock faces on the planet. In El Cap, as it is affectionately known, is home to the world's most famous big wall routes. A handful of early pioneers, including Warren Harding and Robbins, pushed the limits of human potential with the first climbing routes on the wall in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Climbing El Capitan has taken as long as 45 days and has been done in as little as an amazing 1 hour and 58 minutes. An average ascent time in 2020 for El Cap would likely be about 3 to 4 days' time. The risks of the endeavor are well understood, with 30 climbers having lost their lives in 25 separate accidents. Perhaps for those who challenge these walls, Daniel Duane best captures the personified divine character of El Cap, calling the rock simply his 10-megaton Old Testament God. Finding a theoretical frame for such an extreme act of sacred travel is a bit daunting, at least maybe until one considers the remarkable precedents from Japan that highlight a really intriguing connection between mountain hazards and the structure, development, and basic meaning of pilgrimage. I argue that Japanese mountain religiosity yields a worthy theoretical basis for the notion of vertical pilgrimage. In Japan, the sacred vertical has mythological foundations in Shinto, Buddhism, and folk religion more generally. Texts such as the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki describe Izanagi and Izanami, the paired male and female kami charged with earthly genesis, as constructing a sacred pillar linking the terrestrial plane to the heavenly. Likewise, the definitive axis mundi in Buddhism, Mount Sumeru, is understood to be manifest in the form of several famous Japanese mountains. The tradition of Shugendo melds Shinto and Buddhist cosmology and centers itself on nothing less than sacred peaks. The folk nature of mountain religion has diffused its influence throughout pilgrimage culture more generally, so that even the most famous sacred journeys in Japan, like the Shikoku Henro, are filled with hazardous mountain climbing austerities. Working from Shugendo and Henro-related contexts, I'm considering really a selection of structures that may well be integral to any emerging paradigm of vertical pilgrimage. Here I'll just introduce 2 potential structures that show some promise. My previous work looking at written accounts of the Shikoku Henro show that ascetic terminology is used really quite universally in conjunction with the journey. I've demonstrated that language related to pilgrimage austerities spans across a really rather wide spectrum. But this can include sort of basic elements highlighted in recent scholarship on Japanese asceticism by Lobetti, And these elements can include what you might expect: pain, challenges, and bodily effort. Ascetic mountain pilgrimages are often aimed at really the highest level of self-actualization. The famous Shugendo scholar Miyake states, "The object of mountain austerities is to become a Buddha in one's human body." In Japanese, that's called Sokushin Chobutsu. He continues on stating, "The object of worship and the practitioner himself become one and the same." Such transformative training ubiquitously includes dangerous climbing through structured challenges on rock faces, typically with the use of in situ chains to aid the climber. These rock climbing challenges are most generally called gyoba in Japanese, which simply means locations for ascetic practice. But when Japanese hear the term gyoba, they're going to tend to think of a rock face. Indeed, the sacred vertical is essential in the creation of numerous Japanese Buddhist saints, including Enno Gyoja, Kobodaishi, and with respect to Mount Fuji, Matsudai Shonin, who curiously is said to have self-mummified. A unique and essential component regarding sort of the meaning and impact of vertical pilgrimage in Japan is the centrality of risk-fueled concentration. Zenjo is the Japanese term for the Sanskrit word dhyana, which implies a sort of mental concentration on a single object, as if you were in a meditative state. The Zen in Zenjo is the same ideograms as that for Zen Buddhism. Zenjo is often used simply to describe climbing in Japan, although occasionally sometimes traversing or descending with respect to the sacred vertical. Swanson translates an official Shugendo publication which explains that in Zenjo, one is free of distractions. In the quotation says, "As a man cannot think of money or sex while negotiating a dangerous climb, so he must be single-minded and pure." In sum, Japanese mountain religious contexts establish rock climbing as a curious and distinct ascetic act. On the steep and challenging flanks of El Capitan, we curiously see similar descriptions to those in Japan regarding hyper-focused states of concentration that are brought about in part through implicit mountain risks. Yvon Chouinard, I believe you've heard of. He's the famous founder of the outdoor company Patagonia. Chouinard was an early pioneer with some of the first ascents of El Capitan. And in particular, he's famous for an early route which he dubbed nothing less than the Muir Wall in honor of his predecessor. In the final section of the climb on the Muir Wall, Chouinard offers kind of a pointed description. He states, "With more receptive senses, we now appreciated everything around us. Each individual crystal in the granite stood out in bold relief. This unity with our joyous surroundings, this ultra-penetrating perception gave us a feeling of contentment that we had not had for years." Doug Robinson, in his famous essay written in 1969 called "The Climber as Visionary," sees a direct link between the ascetic elements in big wall climbing and the higher consciousness described by Chouinard. And Robinson explains he, as Chouinard, was tempered by the technical difficulties, pain, apprehension, dehydration, striving, the sensory desert, weariness, the gradual loss of self. Further, the author notes that the practice itself is really a system with particular ingredients that, if copied, will sort of lead anyone to this higher state of consciousness. Seemingly unaware of Japanese mountain religious traditions, Robinson curiously believes climbing is sort of a Western analog to Eastern ascetic practices. And he says that climbing appears well suited to liberating the individual from his concept of self. Numerous other vertical pilgrims would connect the dangers on big walls with this ideal state of hyper-awareness, and quite a bit of discourse would emerge in this regard. But I'll call your attention to Dean Potter, who was really an evangelist for the hyper-spirituality of vertical pilgrimage. Potter was born in 1972 and passed away in 2015. And he set numerous early speed records on El Capitan by advancing a bold new style that minimized uses of ropes. Potter explains his perspective. Something about death consequences brings out the heightened consciousness. He further elaborates, I can trigger heightened awareness through putting myself in harm's way and focusing on my breath. That simple focus on the breath, that meditation I do, brings out the higher senses. That's the majority of my art. Potter would go on to famously crash and die while flying a wingsuit across Yosemite Valley. But he would also become an archetype in a famous New York Times and Wall Street Journal best-selling book called The Rise of Superman. So he would become an archetype for this new type of Superman who had mastered the vast potential of flow. For contemporary climbers, flow has come to dominate discourse related to hyperconcentration. And the term is remarkably kindred to the Japanese notion of Zenjo. Positive psychologist Csikszentmihalyi describes flow as a state of total absorption in an activity to the extent that one loses a sense of time and even very ego consciousness. Very early in his seminal work on flow, Csikszentmihalyi recognized rock climbing as an ideal activity for the production of these types of experiences. Flow states are understood to be optimal experiences that are integral to both deep and lasting human happiness and also maximizing human potential. Curiously, the psychologist notes that because flow is so profound, one can become sort of addicted to these pursuits, and we see many El Cap climbers returning sort of again and again and again. Likewise, deep flow experiences in one area of life are often thought to facilitate the development of flow in other endeavors as well. In Japanese mountain ascetics often say that you have to take the lessons of Zenjo back to the everyday world with you. So in conclusion, when thinking about the links of Japanese mountain asceticism really to these extreme practices on El Capitan, I must say that considering vertical pilgrimage in Japan, we see ritual structures in corresponding doctrines that intend to quickly advance the practitioner, often by subjecting him or her to physical dangers and challenges related to rocks. We can easily see that the sacred vertical is likewise integral to famous pilgrimages like the Shikoku Henro, and it can be a vital element in the biography of numerous Japanese saints. Nonetheless, really far from being uniquely Japanese, the fundamental characteristics of vertical pilgrimage are easily understood to be an intriguing analytical blueprint to consider the quest for peak experiences in other mountain pilgrimage contexts, such as those famously on El Capitan.